By the time Harborough started calling Matteo Varela Saint, he had already spent 3 years knowing he was anything but one. Every Thursday, just before sunset, he locked the barbershop door, turned the sign to closed, and shaved an old man who could barely remember his own name. The old man was Elias Mercer. Some afternoons he thought the year was 1987. Some afternoons he asked whether his mother knew where he was. Some afternoons he stared into the mirror with the offended confusion of a man ambushed by old age without ever consenting to it. People on the street loved the ritual. They slowed outside the window, smiled at the warm lather on Elias's cheeks, and told each other that kindness still existed on one corner of Harbor Row. But let them believe whatever version comforted them. He did not shave Elias for kindness. He shaved him because Dad had a face, and every Thursday it sat beneath the overhead light while he held a blade to its throat. Harbor Row barbers had belonged to his father, Gabriel Varela, for almost 30 years. Matteo inherited the shop after Gabriel died of a stroke at 50. He got the cracked leather chairs, the chipped mirrors, the unpaid supplier invoices, and a reputation for being quieter than the man who came before him. Gabriel had been loved on the street. He remembered names, gave free trims before funerals, and knew how to make lonely men feel less alone while the clippers buzzed. What most of Harbor Row never knew was that Gabriel Varela had been generous in daylight and weak in the dark. Matteo knew because weakness had lived in his house like a second father. At 30th, Matteo had his father's hands and his mother's silence. He spoke little, cut precisely, and disliked the warm stories customers projected onto him because warmth had never built anything honest in his family. He lived above the shop in the same apartment where he had grown up. His mother, Teresa, had moved to her sister's flat in Valencia after Gabriel's death. They spoke enough to remain family and not enough to become truthful. Every Thursday at 6:15, a volunteer from St. Anne's Memory residence walked Elias down the block and into the shop. The volunteer changed. The ritual did not. "Good evening, Mr. Mercer," Matteo would say. Elias would blink at him, suspicious or blank or briefly amused. "Have we met?" "Many times." "Are you a doctor?" "No." "Worse. I'm a barber." Sometimes Elias laughed at that. Sometimes he didn't. He always sat in the end, and Matteo always watched for the one thing he feared more than anything else. Recognition, not true memory. Just a flash. A Luke suggesting some locked drawer in the old man's head had rattled open for a second and found the wrong decade, the wrong road, the wrong dead girl. If stories about guilt, memory, and debts that refuse to die with the people involved pull you in, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Do you think doing a good thing still counts if the reason behind it is painful? The first time Matteo put a razor to Elias's face, he had been 29 and furious. He had not started the Thursday ritual until months after Gabriel's funeral, when a woman from St. Anne's came in asking whether he might do a kindness for one of their residents. Matteo almost said no. The shop was struggling. Gabriel had left more debt than the family had understood while he was alive. Grief did not pay rent. Then the woman said the resident's name, Elias Mercer. At that name, the room changed. Matteo still remembered the police report somewhere. Calle Primavera. A fatal hit, a 14-year-old girl named Inés Salvatierra, dead before the ambulance arrived. The driver fled. 2 days later, a witness confessed. That witness was Elias Mercer. He went to prison for 6 years. By the time he came back, nobody wanted him near their children, their shops, or their good opinion. Gabriel never spoke much about the case. That silence became suspicious once Matteo grew old enough to understand that moods had causes. His father drank more that year. His mother stopped singing while she cooked. When Matteo was 15, he found Gabriel sitting alone in the dark shop, with both hands flat on the counter and tears running openly down his face. Gabriel had looked up and said only, "Some men spend their whole lives walking around a thing they deserved in 1 second." Matteo did not understand then. He understood at 21, when Teresa finally told him the truth. Gabriel had been the one driving the car. Drunk after cards, terrified after impact. He drove home shaking, told Elias what happened, and swore his life was over. Elias, already ruined in smaller ways and freshly fired from the dockyards, went to the police the next morning and said he had done it. Why? Because years earlier, Gabriel had pulled him from the harbor after a winter foe that should have killed him. Because gratitude turns poisonous when mixed with salt. Because some men think destroying themselves is the closest they will ever come to proving love. Teresa had whispered it like a confession she hated carrying. Your father said Elias chose it, as if that made it clean. As if gratitude makes a lie holy. Mateo never forgot that sentence. Neither did he forget the way Gabriel kept living, running the shop, raising a son, letting the neighborhood love him as if innocence were a thing other people could lend you forever. So when St. Anne's asked for kindness for Elias Mercer, Mateo heard something much uglier than charity. He heard history asking to be touched. He went to the care home the next morning, under the excuse of checking whether transport would be difficult. He found Elias in the garden trying to button a cardigan that was already buttoned. The old man looked smaller than Mateo expected. Prison, labor, drink, time, and now dementia had reduced him into someone almost anonymous. If guilt had once lived in him, it had been worn away into fragments that no longer lined up cleanly. Mr. Mercer, Mateo said. Elias looked up. Depends who wants him. Mateo stood there thinking of Ines, of Gabriel, of 6 years in prison for another man's crime. Then he said, I'm the barber's son. To his surprise, Elias flinched. Not because he remembered everything, because somewhere beneath the ruin, the name Varela still had weight. He came to the shop the next Thursday. He came again after that. Soon the neighborhood began noticing. By the 10th visit, people were praising Mateo openly. He hated that almost as much as he hated the pity in their voices when they described Elias. Poor man. Punished enough. As if forgetting were justice, one local journalist asked to photograph the ritual for a piece about compassion. Mateo threw him out before he reached the second question. An old customer named Luis liked to say, your father would be proud of you. That almost made Mateo hit him. Would he? Proud that the man who took his crime now received clean shaves from the son who inherited both the secret and the mess. Proud that silence had become a family trade. Then, on a warm Thursday in June, the bell over the door rang unexpectedly. It was Teresa. She stood in the doorway in a navy blouse, carrying the careful posture of someone who had rehearsed his visit several times on the train ride in. Mateo's first word was, closed. I can see that, she said. Then she saw Elias in the chair. For one long second, all the years between them disappeared. Teresa's face drained. Elias looked at her through the mirror and smiled faintly. You have your husband's eyes, he said. Teresa put one hand to the doorframe like she needed the wall to negotiate with the floor. You remember me? No, Elias said, but I remember being sorry. That was the truest sentence anyone in the room had spoken all day. Teresa sat near the window while Mateo finished the shave in silence. When the volunteer returned, she stood but did not approach. Elias passed her without another sign of recognition and let himself be led out into the evening. After the door shut, she asked, What are you doing? Working, Mateo said. You know what I mean? He kept his back turned. Do I? I heard about this months ago. At first I thought people had it wrong. Then I realized they didn't. Every Thursday? Yes. Why? Mateo dried the razor and set it down with too much care. Interesting question from you. Teresa closed her eyes. I didn't come for punishment. No. You came because guilt gets lonely if it thinks it has moved too far away. That landed. Good, he thought. I should have told the truth after your father died, she said. Mateo laughed without warmth. After... Convenient timing. I was afraid. He was dead. Yes, she snapped. And Ines was still dead, and Elias had already lost 6 years, and the whole street had built itself on a version of your father that would collapse if I spoke. I was afraid of that collapse. I was afraid of what it would make you. It made me this anyway, Mateo said. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Teresa reached into her handbag and placed an old envelope on the counter. St. Anne's cold, she said. They found this in his room. Your name was on it. The handwriting on the envelope was Gabrielle's. She touched it only long enough to let go. Read it before you decide what you want to hate next. 10 say left. The envelope sat on the counter until nearly midnight. Mateo closed the shop. counted a till, swept the floor, and finally carried it upstairs. Inside was a letter. Not to Teresa. Not to him. To Elias. If you're reading this, it means I finally failed to outrun what you carried from me. That's fair. It was always fairer than what I asked of you. Mateo stopped there and had to start again. Gabriel wrote that Elias had tried 3 times over the years to tell the truth, and each time Gabriel begged him not to. Once because Mateo was still a child. Once because Teresa threatened to leave. Once because Gabriel said prison would kill him now when he might have survived it then. I called that protecting my family, Gabriel wrote. I know now it was only cowardice, wearing devotion. Then came the part Mateo could not stop rereading. Elias never asked me for payment, forgiveness, or friendship. The free haircuts near the end were not kindness. They were penance, so small I'm ashamed to write them down. At the bottom, Gabriel wrote, if my son ever finds himself in your presence after I'm gone, I pray he chooses a better kind of justice than silence, though silence is the only thing I ever taught him properly. Mateo sat with that letter until dawn. 5 days later, Thursday, came again. Elias sat in the chair and asked, do I know you? Mateo looked at him in the mirror. Unfortunately, yes. He lathered the brush slowly. His anger had changed shape. Before, it had been clean enough to use. Now it was mixed with pity, and pity always made him feel contaminated. Halfway through the shave, Elias touched the arm of the chair and frowned. I used to have a brother, he said. What happened to him? Mateo asked. He stopped speaking to me. Or maybe I stopped speaking to him. Hard to know when the shame is old enough. Then, unexpectedly, Elias looked straight at Mateo in the mirror. I ruined a family once. The razor hovered. Elias blinked, and the moment thinned. Did you say your name was Daniel? That night Mateo drove to St. Anne's for the first time without being asked. A nurse named Pilar recognized him. He asked about Elias, and that was how he learned about the notebook. The staff had given Elias a lined exercise book to help anchor memory. Most entries were nonsense now. Wrong dates, grocery lists, names without context, but one phrase repeated over and over in different forms. It should have been me. Mateo turned the pages in the corridor with hands steadier than he felt. I hear tires when I wake up. The boy had his father's ears. Primera atet. That he saved me in the harbor and I drowned us both. Anyway, then the line that froze him. She was wearing blue socks. Mateo had never known that detail. Nobody mentioned socks in the version told on the street. Truth was always uglier in specifics. On the last page, written so heavily the pen nearly tore through, were the words, if the son hates me, let him. Hatred is at least the truth. Mateo laughed once under his breath. The sound men make when pain and recognition arrive together and neither is polite enough to wait. On Thursday, he opened the shop late. Customers complained. He did not care. At 6:18, Elias arrived looking especially lost. Cold today, he said, though it was warm outside. Mateo draped the cape over him and said, do you know my father's name? Elias stared at the mirror. No. Gabriel Varela. For a moment, nothing. Then Elias's mouth parted slightly. He looked tired in a way that was older than dementia. Ah, he said, that was all. Not because it meant little, because it meant everything, and the machinery for carrying everything had mostly gone. You knew, Mateo said. I knew enough to ruin myself, and not enough to fix anything, Elias answered. Why did you do it? This was the question that had fed half Mateo's life. Elias closed his eyes, because he begged. That's not a reason. No, Elias whispered. It was weakness. Mine first, then his, then everyone else's. He opened his eyes again, and for one impossible second they were clear. She was 14, he said. Your father kept saying if he went away, you would become him anyway. Funny thing to say to the man you're asking to vanish in your place. Mateo could not breathe properly for several seconds. Did you ever hate him? He asked. Elias almost smiled. Every day, but not as much as I hated the part of me that still loved him. After. That was the line that finally cracked something open inside Matteo. He finished the shave with shaking hands. When it was done, Elias touched his own face in wonder, then looked at Matteo and asked, "How much do I owe you?" Matteo stared for a long moment. Then he said, "More than you can pay, less than you already did." The truth reached Harbor Row the next week. Not from Matteo. From Teresa. She told Father Lucio first, then Rosa Delgado, then the Salvatierra family. If there was to be collapse, she said, it should at least happen in the correct order. The street did what streets always do when truth arrives late. It rewrote memory with indecent speed. People claimed they'd always suspected Gabriel carried something dark. They spoke of Elias with sudden softness, as if sympathy after the fact were the same thing as loyalty before it. The Salvatierra family did not forgive publicly. Matteo respected them more for that. They visited St. Anne's once. Ines' mother stood at Elias's bedside for less than 5 minutes and said, "You should have let the right man drown." Tenso left. Elias died 2 Thursdays later, not in Matteo's chair, which would have been too poetic. In bed at St. Anne's, just after sunrise, with no recognition left in his eyes. Pilar called the shop at 8:11. Matteo listened, thanked her, and opened at 10 like always. That evening at 6:15. With the sign turned to closed, he locked the door out of habit and stood in the empty shop under the overhead light with the clean chair waiting. That was when he finally cried. Not only for Elias, for Gabriel, for Teresa, for Ines Salvatierra and the Blue Sox, and the years crushed under the wheel of 1 second, for the horrible human truth that men can ruin each other out of love and cowardice so mixed together neither survives clean. A week later, Matteo hung a small brass plaque beside the mirror near chair 2. For Elias Mercer, who carried what was not his and lost everything to it. Customers asked about it. Matteo answered only when he felt like it. Some called it forgiveness. It wasn't. Forgiveness was too elegant a word for what had happened. What he felt was rougher than that, a kind of acceptance with scars still visible through it. If anyone had asked him what he finally learned, he would have said this: guilt does not stay where it begins. It spreads. It breeds silence. It changes shape inside every person who agrees to carry even a corner of it. And if this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, do you think taking the blame for someone you love is an act of love, or the beginning of destroying everyone involved?